In our last Project Street Sleeper video, we fabbed up a new exhaust system that uses a little trickery to make good power while keeping everything looking stock. Now we're going to focus on feeding this beast plenty of fuel. Let's get to work. A good high-flowing fuel system that is matched to your combination is essential to making good, reliable power. Depending on your power goals, you may need to completely re-engineer your fuel system with larger lines, an upgraded fuel pressure regulator, a bigger fuel rail, and so on. For our modest power goals, an upgraded fuel pump and higher flowing injectors should do the job well. Let's start with the fuel pump. I chose the good old trusty Walbro 255 liter per hour high pressure fuel pump. I've run this same type of pump in many of my turbo cars in the past and have always found it to be a good performer. There are better options for higher power setups, but for what we're doing here, this will work great. I ordered a Galant VR-4 specific install kit, but the folks at Walbro make kits for lots of cars. Unfortunately, just dropping in a new higher flowing fuel pump in these cars doesn't quite cut it. The puny stock wiring limits voltage to the pump, drastically decreasing its output. Based on testing found on Road Race Engineering's website, voltage at the battery is typically 13.5 to 14 volts with the engine running. Meanwhile, all the way back at the fuel pump, they measured a weak 11.9 volts. To fix this, I picked up a fuel pump rewire kit from Street Tuned Motorsports. It includes all the necessary wiring and parts to get the job done. Just a quick note, this kit is designed for a first generation DSM. I found that I needed a little more primary wire to reach from the battery to the trunk of the Galant. With all of our tools and parts laid out on our handy Ranger Products rolling work table, we're ready to tackle this job. Our Galant's fuel pump access is in the trunk, so our first step is to remove the carpet and spare tire cover. Then we unscrew and remove the fuel pump access panel, which allows us to peer into the murky depths where our fuel lines and sending unit live. Thankfully, this car is in very good shape, so this area is just dirty. But some Rust Belt car owners may find a real corroded mess in here. I then unplugged the harness from the lower panel and removed it. To loosen things up a bit, I sprayed penetrating oil on the sending unit nuts and the fuel lines and let it sit for a day or so. After that, I started by loosening the fuel feed line. This fitting is usually very tight, so use good line wrenches and go slow. From there, I removed the mounting nuts, and then pulled the fuel pump assembly out. With the pump out, you get a good look at the insides of your gas tank. For any older car, especially one that's been sitting, make sure there's no rust or other gunk in here. Here's a look at the stock fuel pump hanger assembly. It's a pretty simple design and includes the float for the fuel level sensor too. Now it's time to remove the stock fuel pump from the hanger and install the Walbro. First off, I installed the new inlet filter onto the Walbro pump, which makes the old one look really dirty. To make room for the Walbro, I had to remove this fuel pump outlet neck. After cleaning up any rough spots from the cut, I test fitted the new pump to the hanger. You can see here how this length of fuel hose Walbro provides links the pump to the outlet line. The test fit looked good, so I slid on the provided pump insulator sleeve. Here's how the pump looks installed in the hanger and ready to drop back into the tank. After carefully wiggling it back in there, installation is the reverse of removal. With that done, it's now time to install the fuel pump rewire kit. I started by removing this splash panel in the passenger side fender well, which will allow me to run the primary wire from the battery without it being visible in the engine bay. Who's a sneaky snake? Starting at the battery, I connected a fitting to the end of the primary wire and attached it to the battery terminal connection. We can't have this blue wire sticking out like a sore thumb under the hood, so I covered it in factory-style black loom and will tuck it under the battery cable later on. Next, I started feeding the wire through the fender grommets and then into the passenger compartment. The nylon tubing you see here is the signal for the boost gauge, which I decided to run through this same grommet. More on that later. The primary wire and the boost gauge line pop out in the area where the ECU lives. After taking the slack out of the primary wire and boost gauge tubing, I secured them to the existing wiring using zip ties. From here, I removed the necessary trim pieces and back seat so I could run the primary wire carefully through the passenger compartment, following existing wiring that travels under the carpet. I covered the whole length of wire in loom to prevent any possibility of it getting chafed. After that, I removed this panel from the trunk so I could find a home for my new fuel pump relay that comes with the rewire kit. While I was in there, something that had been bugging me was this broken power antenna mast. I searched for a working replacement with no luck, so when I saw a Galant appear in the local U-Pull-It, I grabbed this non-power antenna off of it. It's an exact replacement, but with a fixed mast instead of the trouble-prone electric one. Installing it was simple, and it freed up lots of room in this area. Okay, back to the fuel pump rewire. Now, using the instructions that came with the rewire kit, I wired up the primary wire, fuel pump signal, feed wire, and ground, and then connected it all to the relay plug. After that's done, I mounted the relay in a safe spot back here in the trunk, and then tightened everything up. With that job out of the way, we head back up to the front of the car to install a set of upgraded fuel injectors. To handle the important task of adding fuel to the fire, I chose these 850cc injectors from Fuel Injector Clinic. These low-impedance disc injectors are exact replacements for the stock injectors and are flow matched to within 1% of one another. Fuel Injector Clinic also includes this detailed flow sheet for your specific injectors. To install our new injectors, we start by moving the throttle cable out of the way, carefully removing the cam angle and throttle position sensor plugs, and then the PCV valve and hose. Now we have a good look at the stock 450cc injectors. After carefully removing the injector plugs and a few other odds and ends, this part of the engine harness can be lifted up and out of the way. Then I remove the fuel feed and return lines, making sure to catch any excess fuel that spilled out. Now the fuel rail can be unbolted and the fuel injectors and rail can be lifted out. Watch for any seals that may be left behind. As you can see here, all of my injector O-rings stayed in the head and had to be pulled out with a pick. Here's a look at the stock fuel rail, regulator, and injector assembly. Most all of my rubber injector O-rings and such were very brittle, so it's a good thing that our new injectors come with all new seals. Installing the new injectors into the fuel rail is easy. I just lubed up the O-rings a little and pushed them in until they seated. Once that is done, I carried the assembly over to the car and plugged it all back into the head. I took my time here and made sure the seals and injectors were seated properly. A pinched or misaligned seal can mean a dangerous fuel leak or a big boost leak. After that, I torqued down the fuel rail, reconnected my fuel lines, and plugged everything back in. This is a pretty darn good sleeper mod, as you really have to look closely to see that the injectors are different. Our next job was to install a way to control and then keep an eye on our boost levels. For control, we're using this Hallman ES boost controller. This is a tried and true design, and I've been running these with great, consistent results for many years. The instructions are very easy. You just connect one end to a boost source, like this one on our turbo outlet, and then the other end to our wastegate actuator. Finding a good place to mount your controller usually takes longer than the installation, and for now I'm picking this sort of hidden spot on the radiator fan. I may move it to a sneakier spot once I get the car dialed in later on. To keep that stock look, I made sure to use these factory clips on the vacuum hoses. For monitoring boost, I chose this autometer gauge that I had lying around. To mount it, I picked up this gauge cup that I also got from Autometer. Installing this is also pretty simple. You just need to run a signal line and find a place to mount the gauge. For my boost signal, I chose the P port on my throttle body. To prepare my signal line that runs from the engine bay into the car, I used the provided nylon tubing, which connects using this brass compression fitting. After connecting that, I screwed on a hose adapter and connected that to my boost signal line from the throttle body. I then tucked it all out of the way and out of sight. Earlier you saw me feed this line into the passenger compartment. So where do you mount the boost gauge in a sleeper? Well, out of sight, of course. I chose the glove box, which is my go-to move these days. In fact, I hid all of the modern gizmos and doodads in my Grand Nationals glove box to keep the interior looking stock and original. For the Galant, tucking the boost gauge away in the glove box keeps things looking completely original and works fine for the rare occasion that I need to eyeball it. It's been my experience that once I get my car dialed in, I rarely need to look at the boost gauge anyway. Okay guys, I didn't document this next part. I knew that only a special brand of crazy person like myself would go to these lengths to uphold their sleeper status. Just know that I spent hours and hours thinking about and drawing up an undercover high-flowing air filter setup. I contemplated using speed density, but given my modest power goals, the drivability and ease of tuning of a mass airflow sensor made the most sense to me. So I got my hands on a good used mass airflow sensor from a newer Lancer Evolution. I also picked up this cool plug-and-play adapter harness that is made by a good guy by the name of David on the Galant VR-4 forums marketplace. The harness allows you to simply plug one end into your stock mass airflow harness, and then plug the other end into the much higher flowing EVO MAF. Now here's the non-documented part. I took the EVO MAF sensor, the adapter plug, and a K&N filter and jammed it all into the stock Galant VR-4 air can. So here's some of my stealthiest work. Yep, that's the EVO MAF that you see hiding in there, and that's the adapter harness positioned where the old stock MAF plug used to live. Once I got it all together, installing it was easy. I just bolted it up and plugged it in. Oh man, huh? What you know about being sneaky? Thanks for watching. I want to say hello to both the new and old subscribers and Facebook friends who've been sending so much support my way. I truly do appreciate it. In our next Street Sleeper video, we'll install our methanol injection system, so keep an eye out for that one. So with that said, thanks again folks, we'll see you next time. I also want to thank ECM Tuning, Detective Coding, and Forced Performance for supporting Tom's Turbo Garage. Please check them out as they not only do great work, they're great people too.